The Norcadian Empire had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, until humanity's secret super soldiers joined the war and brought the evil aliens to their knees. On the bridge of the Norcadian flagship, Supreme Commander Deneb slammed his fist on the console. He watched a live video feed of the Norcadian colony on planet Zephyr being utterly decimated. Powerful energy beams rained down from orbit, systematically vaporizing every trace of Norcadian presence. The colony's planetary defense batteries lay in smoking ruins, already destroyed by the opening salvo. The attackers' ships were sleek, angular, and colored a menacing black, emblazoned with a symbol Deneb had come to hate and fear, a silver fist clutching a burst of flame. The insignia of the Terran Special Forces, humanity's most elite warriors. Deneb's reverie was interrupted by the arrival of his trusted lieutenant, Morlock. Supreme Commander, the humans have somehow bypassed the Zephyr system's early warning sensors and achieved complete surprise, Morlock reported grimly. Deneb clenched his teeth. Converge all ships on Zephyr immediately. Morlock shook his head. Impossible, sir. There are no ships within range, and the fleet is too scattered, suppressing a dozen slave rebellions that have spontaneously erupted across the galaxy. Deneb started to bark orders to recall the fleet anyway, when his communications officer suddenly shouted in alarm. Long-range sensors have just detected a massive force of Terran ships, larger than any seen before, emerging from hyperspace at the edge of Norcadian space. As reports of more and more Terran ships appearing in every sector poured in, Deneb sank back in his chair with the realization that this was no mere raid, but a full-scale human invasion of the Norcadian Empire. If the humans succeeded in their attack, the Norcadian way of life, built on conquest and oppression, would crumble. Deneb would go down in history as the commander who lost the Empire. Searching for options, Deneb pulled up a file on his console about a secret Norcadian military research project, codenamed Erebus, a final desperate option to deal with the human threat once and for all. It had to work, or the Norcadian Empire was doomed. Captain Michael Boyd's armored boots thudded on the deck as he strode into the armory of the TSF Dauntless. The room was a hive of activity as his strike team cleaned and inspected their weapons, movements precise from years of training and real combat. Boyd grabbed a cloth and joined them, field-stripping his plasma rifle with practiced efficiency. As he worked, he listened to the chatter of his soldiers, their voices slightly distorted by the dropship's air recyclers. Did you see the look on that Norcadian commander's face when we kicked down his door? Priceless. Private Hernandez chuckled darkly as he reassembled his sidearm. Sergeant Takeshi, the team's sniper and tech specialist, glanced up from calibrating his rifle's scope. The poor bastard probably thought Zephyr was safe, their so-called message world. Boyd looked up and met Takeshi's eyes. It was the last one. Command made sure of that. All the other message worlds are glass now. The armory fell silent at that, each soldier contemplating the magnitude of the offensive they were now spearheading. Private Hernandez spoke up again. Why now, Captain? Why'd we suddenly go from containment to invasion? The Norseys have been quiet for years. Takeshi looked sharply at Hernandez. Intel must have picked up something big. Maybe the squids finally built that planet cracker they've been yapping about. Boyd held up a hand, silencing the speculation. Stay focused. Whatever the reason, we have our orders. We hit the next target just as hard as the last. Hua? Hua! His soldiers barked in unison. Suddenly, Boyd's earpiece crackled with an incoming transmission. He listened intently, his face darkening. He stood abruptly. Gear up and get to the ship, double time. We just picked up a distress call from New Carthage. The colony's gone dark and Norcadian ships have been detected in system. The soldiers leapt into motion, slamming magazines into weapons and donning helmets. Boyd was already running for the bridge, his mind racing. New Carthage was days away, even at max burn. He would push the engines past the red line, but they would still arrive far too late to intervene. The colony would have to hold on its own. He just prayed they were ready. On New Carthage, klaxons wailed and red lights flashed, as the colony's sensor net registered the incoming Norcadian fleet. In the command center, Governor Elias Stern studied the tactical display, his jaw clenched. The numbers told a grim story. The enemy outnumbered the colony's defenses 5-1. He keyed the colony-wide comms. All civilians proceed to the underground shelters immediately. Security forces, report to your designated stations and prepare to repel invaders. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Stern turned to his second-in-command, Sergeant Lena Ivanova. They'll hit us with ground forces. We can't hold them in a straight fight. I need you to take a small team and coordinate the resistance from here. What about you, sir? Ivanova asked, even as she started selecting men for the task. I'm going to take the rest of our forces into the city. We'll disperse, make them bleed for every inch. Urban guerrilla tactics, just like the sacking of Corinth. Ivanova nodded grimly, remembering the history lessons. When the Norcadians had attacked Corinth, the humans had made them pay dearly for every city block. As Ivanova rushed to organize the command team, Stern strode to the armory. He donned his old Marine Corps armor, the servos whirring to life as they recognized his biometrics. The HUD flickered on, the familiar reticle a comfort. He grabbed his plasma rifle and headed for the door. Outside, the sky darkened as Norcadian drop pods rained down, smashing into buildings and disgorging heavily armed shock troops. On the streets, the battle was already raging as the entrenched human defenders clashed with the invaders. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds filled the air, the sound of war drowning out all else. Stern took cover behind a burned-out ground car and assessed the situation. The Norcadians had numbers, but the humans had the advantage of knowing the terrain intimately, and they had prepared for this. As he watched, a squad of Norcadians advanced down a side street, only to be engulfed in a massive explosion as they triggered a pre-placed mine. Ambushes like this had been set up all over the city. In the command center, Sergeant Ivanova coordinated the defense, directing troops to key choke points and ordering precision strikes on Norcadian concentrations. Under her guidance, the humans started to push back the invasion, the tide slowly turning. But the reprieve was short-lived. A proximity alert sounded, and Ivanova looked up to see a fresh wave of Norcadian ships entering orbit. Troop transports. The enemy was sending in reinforcements, a seemingly endless horde of new soldiers to turn the battle back in their favor. Governor Stern's voice crackled over the comms, strained and pained. "Ivanova, sit rep!" "Sir, enemy reinforcements have arrived. They're massing for an assault on the command center. We can't hold them, sir. It's over." There was a pause, filled only by the sounds of plasma fire and explosions. Then Stern's voice returned, grim with resolve. "Initiate evacuation plan Omega. Get our people to the shuttles. We'll cover the retreat." "Sir, with respect, you can't. We need—" "That's an order, Sergeant." Ivanova bit back her argument. "Yes, sir. Initiating evacuation." She turned to her team. "You heard the man. Purge the computers and get to the shuttles. I'll stay and cover the retreat." The soldiers hesitated, reluctant to leave their commander, but they obeyed, scrambling to wipe the databanks and destroy anything that couldn't be carried. Ivanova was just about to order the team to move out when the command center doors exploded inward, shards of metal flying like shrapnel. Norcadian shock troops poured through the breach, plasma rifles blazing. The Norcadian shock troops poured through the breach, plasma rifles spitting death. Ivanova and her soldiers returned fire, the command center dissolving into a chaotic swirl of energy bolts and smoke. Ivanova ducked behind a console as a plasma bolt sizzled over her head. She leaned out and snapped off a burst from her rifle, dropping a Norcadian soldier. But for everyone that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. "Fall back!" Ivanova shouted over the din of battle. "To the shuttles now!" The human defenders fought a desperate fighting retreat, trading their lives to buy time for the evacuation. Ivanova was the last to leave, backing into the shuttle bay with her rifle blazing. She barely made it aboard the last shuttle before the doors slammed shut and the engines roared to life. As the shuttle clawed for the safety of space, Ivanova looked out the viewport at the burning ruins of New Carthage, her heart heavy with the knowledge of all those left behind. Days later, the TSF Dauntless emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the New Carthage system. On the bridge, Captain Boyd stared at the viewscreen in horror. Where once a thriving human colony had been, now there was only devastation. The planet's surface was scarred and burning, its gleaming cities reduced to rubble. In orbit, the shattered remnants of New Carthage's defense fleet drifted lifelessly. "Scan for life signs," Boyd ordered, his voice tight. The sensor officer shook his head. "Nothing, sir. No human readings on the surface or in orbit." Boyd's fists clenched. They were too late. But maybe, just maybe, there were survivors. He had to hope. "Ready a landing party. We're going down there." As the Dauntless descended through the atmosphere, Boyd and his squad prepped their gear in the armory, an uncharacteristic silence hanging over the room. They had all seen the scans, knew the likelihood of finding anyone alive was slim. But still they had to try. The Dauntless set down amidst the ruins of the capital city, and Boyd led his team out into the devastation. Everywhere they looked, there was only destruction and death, the streets choked with rubble and the burned-out husks of vehicles. They picked their way through the ruins, weapons at the ready, scanning for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. And then a ping on their sensors, a faint distress beacon, coming from the ruins of the colony's command center. Boyd's heart leapt. Maybe someone had survived after all. He signaled his squad and they moved out, making their way to the source of the signal. They had to clamber over piles of debris, the going slow and treacherous. Finally, they reached what was left of the command center. The building was barely standing, its walls scorched and pitted by weapons fire. They entered cautiously, picking their way through the rubble. Inside, it was a scene from a nightmare. Bodies were everywhere. Norcadian and human alike sprawled in the rictus of violent death. The walls were splattered with blood, the air thick with the stench of decay. But there in the center of the carnage, Boyd saw movement. He rushed over, his heart in his throat. It was Governor Stern. The man was badly wounded, his uniform soaked with blood, but he was alive, if only just. Boyd knelt at his side, cradling the dying man's head. Stern's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. "Boyd?" he rasped, his voice a bare whisper. "Is that you?" "I'm here, Governor," Boyd said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "We're going to get you out of here." But Stern was shaking his head. With a trembling hand, he pressed something into Boyd's palm. A data drive. "Erebus," Stern whispered, his voice urgent despite his fading strength. "You have to stop Erebus." And with that he breathed his last, his hand falling limply to his side. Boyd stared down at the data drive in his hand, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Whatever Erebus was, it was important enough for Stern to use his dying breath to warn him. He slipped the drive into his pocket and stood, his jaw set. They needed to get back to the ship to find out what was on that drive. But as they made their way out of the ruined command center, a hail of plasma fire erupted from the surrounding ruins, Norcadian soldiers lying in wait. Boyd and his squad returned fire, diving for cover amidst the rubble. A fierce firefight ensued, energy bolts crisscrossing the space between the ruined buildings. Boyd's men fought with grim determination, but they were outnumbered and exposed. They started to fall one by one as the Norcadian fire intensified. Boyd gritted his teeth, firing burst after burst from his rifle. They had to make it back to the ship. The information on that data drive could change everything. He signaled to his remaining men, and they made a break for it, dashing from cover to cover as the Norcadians pursued. Plasma bolts sizzled all around them, barely missing. Finally, the Dauntless came into view, its boarding ramp lowered. Boyd and his squad made a final, desperate sprint, the Norcadians hot on their heels. They practically dove into the ship, the ramp slamming shut behind them. The engines roared to life and the Dauntless lifted off, plasma fire pinging off its armored hull. In the ship's computer core, Boyd slotted the data drive into a console with shaking hands. Immediately, a flood of data filled the screens, schematics, formulas, test logs. Boyd's eyes widened as he scanned through it all. Project Erebus, an Orcadian plan to create genetically engineered super-soldiers bred for the sole purpose of killing humans. And according to the files, the first batch was already complete, en route to the front lines aboard a ship called the Nemesis. Boyd slumped back in his chair, the magnitude of the discovery washing over him. This could change the entire course of the war. They had to stop that ship. He immediately sent an urgent transmission to Terran Command, relaying all the information from Stern's drive, but he knew it would take time for the message to reach Earth, for orders to come back. Time they might not have. Boyd made his decision. He strode onto the bridge, his face grim. "Set a course to intercept the Nemesis," he ordered. "We're not letting those abominations reach the battlefront." His crew looked at him in surprise, but they could see the determination in his eyes. They knew what was at stake. The Dauntless leapt into hyperspace, racing against time. It was a desperate gamble, throwing their lone ship against an enemy they knew nothing about. But it was a gamble they had to take. The fate of the war, perhaps the fate of humanity itself, hung in the balance. In the depths of space, the Nemesis cruised onwards, its deadly cargo secure in its holds. Aboard the ship, in a darkened chamber, row after row of pods lined the walls. And within each pod a figure stirred, eyes fluttered open, glowing an eerie, inhuman red. The Erebus soldiers were awakening, and they hungered for human blood. The Dauntless shuddered as it emerged from hyperspace, the twisted wreckage of the Nemesis already visible through the viewports. Boyd stood on the bridge, his face grim as he took in the scene. The Norcadian ship was adrift, its hull breached in a dozen places. "Scan for life signs," Boyd ordered. The sensor officer shook his head. "None, sir, but I am detecting a massive energy buildup in the ship's reactor core. It's going critical." Boyd's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to scuttle the ship. Hernandez, Takeshi, gear up, we're going in." Minutes later, Boyd and his team were jetting across the void, the Nemesis looming before them. They breached the hull with explosive charges, clambering through the jagged opening into the ship's dark interior. The corridors were eerily silent, the only sound the clanking of the soldiers' boots on the metal deck. They moved cautiously, weapons at the ready, checking each corner and doorway. Suddenly a hulking shape lunged from the shadows, barreling into Hernandez and sending him flying. Boyd and Takeshi opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling through the air, but the creature seemed to shrug them off. It was an Erebus soldier, a monstrous figure twice the size of a human, its muscles bulging grotesquely beneath its armored skin. Its eyes glowed a malevolent red as it charged, a roar of rage echoing from its throat. Boyd rolled to the side, barely avoiding a sweeping blow that dented the bulkhead. He came up firing, aiming for the creature's head. Takeshi flanked it, pumping plasma into its back. The Erebus soldier staggered but didn't fall, spinning with surprising speed to backhand Takeshi across the corridor. Boyd leapt onto its back, jabbing his rifle into the gap at the base of its skull and firing point blank. The creature finally went down, slumping to the deck with a ground-shaking thud. Boyd scrambled off it, checking on his men. Hernandez was dazed but alive, Takeshi nursing a broken arm. "We need to keep moving," Boyd said, reloading his rifle. "The reactor core is this way." They fought their way deeper into the ship, each corridor and chamber a brutal gauntlet of Erebus soldiers and Norcadian defenders. By the time they reached the reactor room, half of Boyd's team was dead or wounded. Boyd planted the charges himself, his hands slick with blood, some of it his own. As the timer ticked down, they raced back through the ship, the surviving Erebus soldiers hot on their heels. They barely made it to their breach pod before the charges detonated, the shockwave hurling them clear of the ship. Boyd watched from the pod's viewport as the Nemesis vanished in a blinding flash of light, a miniature sun blooming in the darkness of space. But there was no time for celebration. Boyd's comms officer was frantically waving for his attention, his face pale. "Sir, we're getting reports from the colony below. They're saying something was released from the Nemesis when it exploded. Some kind of bioweapon. It's already in the atmosphere. Boyd felt a chill run down his spine. Set course for the colony, maximum burn. We need to evacuate as many as we can. But it was already too late. By the time the Dauntless reached the colony, the streets were filled with the twisted, mutated bodies of the colonists, their flesh warped beyond recognition. In the following weeks, the nightmare only grew worse. The bioweapon spread from system to system, an unstoppable plague that left only death in its wake. Human worlds fell one by one until the galaxy was littered with the ruins of a once proud civilization. In a final, desperate bid for survival, the remnants of humanity fled into the uncharted reaches of space, scattering to the cosmic winds. On the bridge of the Dauntless, Boyd watched the last blue-green marble of an Earth-like world disappear from the viewscreen, replaced by the cold, infinite black of deep space. A message blinked on his console, a final transmission from Earth before it went dark. Remember us. Boyd's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. He would remember. As long as he lived, as long as humanity endured, he would carry the memory of all they had lost. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the universe, he would find a way to make the Norcadians pay. The Dauntless turned its prow to the stars and accelerated into the unknown, carrying the last flickering hope of the human race into the depths of uncharted space. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.